Okay, I think we're going to get started here. It's been a long day, but a really nourishing and thought-provoking one with 5 other discussions that occurred from 10 a.m. until now. So tonight we're going to wrap up the day with phenomenal Toufic Haddad, whom I had the honor to meet a couple of months ago in Zagreb and listen to his talk, which definitely inspired the invitation to bring him over here. Toufic Haddad is a Palestinian academic and the author of a book, Palestine, LTD, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territories. He also co-edited the book Between the Lines, Readings on Israel, the Palestinians, and the US War on Terror. Toufic holds a PhD in Development Studies from the School for Oriental and African Studies in London and has worked in various capacities across the occupied Palestinian territories as a journalist, researcher, consultant, editor, and publisher, including for several UN bodies. Until recently, he lived in the East Jerusalem, where he worked as the director of the Council for British Research in the 11th Jerusalem branch, the Kenyon Institute. And the very institute made him redundant in October of 2023. So ever since then, Toufic has been fighting a case before the UK courts with the backing of many organizations and intellectuals, including the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. Toufic, it's really an honor to welcome you at Grounded Festival. And I am very excited to be in this conversation with you. Toufic is going to deliver a talk. We're going to have a bit of a different format than the formats you've witnessed over the day. Toufic is going to be having a lecture or a talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to get into a Q&A session. As I was before in his talk, I will just caution you in a very good way. Take out your notebooks or your phones and start taking notes, because what he delivers is extremely important. His lectures are fact-based, they're thought-provoking, he delivers really concise and profound arguments. And I'm really inspired for different intellectual or excited about different intellectual and creative labors that your talk is going to inspire. So thank you for being here. I'll let you talk now.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Emina. I hope I can deliver. Inshallah. Before I start, I'd like to sort of also thank the organizers from Grounded, Barbara especially, and the whole team that's putting this together. I'd like to also give special thanks to Emina, who gave my name to the festival so that I could be here today. And I'd also like to make one other thank you to the Pirate Care Collective in Rijeka and across Europe, different parts of Europe, who brought me initially to this part of the world and enabled me to meet folks like Emina and eventually you folks today. So it's a great honor for me to be here. I hope what I can deliver today is, well, I'm going to attempt to basically make a concerted political intervention into where things stand today for people in general and for folks in Slovenia who have been witnessing everything that we've been witnessing in Gaza for the past 22 months. Of course, this is rather daunting. I entitled my talk, The Challenge of Gaza Between Hope and Despair. We'll get to the hope part a little bit later, but the dominant feeling that we have is one of despair, I think, or that's certainly the fear that after 22 months of witnessing horrific violence and genocide, and with no end in sight, and the possibility that it could continue and get much, much worse, and we'll also talk about that there is this fear that we could fall into despair. But I will also argue that we do not have that luxury, and as serious political actors, we actually have a role to play, and there's a lot we can do, and we can stop this genocide, and we will stop this genocide. But that is a question that we need to address ourselves as individuals as well as movements, and to have serious discussions about it without any false senses of hope or romanticization. So, unfortunately, I have to begin this talk with a serious part about it, which is the question of the genocide. Today alone, 71 people have been killed, 250 have been injured. Overall, we're talking about a situation where around 62,000 people have been killed since past October 23, 164,000 injured. Since the ceasefire ended just last March, we are talking about 10,700 people who have been killed, another 45,000 who have been injured. Just 2 days ago, there was a report in The Guardian that said even according to Israeli statistics, 83% of the casualties were civilian or non-militants. We are talking about 19,000 children who have been killed, 540 children a month, and 28,000 women and girls who have been killed since the beginning of this. Back in July 2024, the British medical journal, The Lancet, published a statistic that said, we can't just quantify this in terms of the bodies that have been brought into the hospitals. For every casualty or death, a body that has been brought to a hospital, there are many indirect deaths. And they made their own calculation, basically coming up with a figure that they estimated that the true figure was much closer to 186,000. That was in July 2024. Using the same ratio today of indirect deaths, we are talking about a situation of 314,000 people who have been killed in Gaza today. Gaza has 2.3 million people. I didn't do the percentage, but we're talking about 12% of the population potentially, 13%, somewhere in there, of the population has been killed so far. Of course, there's also food. The question of food has become a weapon of war, very overtly and openly. And today, 3 different United Nations agencies, the Food and Agricultural Organization, UN World Food Program, and World Health Organization, basically said that, yes, it is starvation that is happening. 640,000 people are in a catastrophic level of food insecurity, and 1.1 are in the territory of being in an emergency. When they classified a famine, they said that when you classify a famine, you have to pass 3 sort of critical thresholds. One has to do with extreme food deprivation, acute malnutrition, and starvation-related deaths. And according to the UN, just today, all 3 of these have been breached, given the reasonable evidence that these criteria have been all met. It's one thing to discuss the sheer numbers. It's another thing to also speak to some extent about the nature of these deaths. I don't want to use the word qualitative, but to some extent, to keep that in mind, we're talking about a situation of 270 journalists who have been killed, 1,581 health workers, 95% of the schools have been destroyed, 12 universities are damaged or are also destroyed, 12,000 students have been killed, and 492 teachers and university and staff administrators have also been killed. Of course, 90% of the population has already been forcibly displaced. Let's not forget that these are refugees, originally refugees who have been prevented to be refugees again, who are becoming internally displaced from their own refugee camps for perhaps 5th, 6th, 7th time since this happened, but also many of them were also internally displaced within the Gaza Strip throughout the history of the Gaza Strip, a history that I don't have time to go into, but has a lot of internal displacement as well. Over 100,000 tons of explosives have been dropped on the Gaza Strip, equivalent to somewhere between 5 and 6 nuclear bombs. The total territory of the Gaza Strip is 365 square kilometers. The total territory of Ljubljana is 275 square kilometers. The population of Ljubljana is about 300,000. We said Gaza is 2.3, so it's about 7 times the amount. So kind of try to imagine a territory 1/3 the size larger, but with 7 times the population, and what 5 to 6 nuclear bombs would have done to a place like Ljubljana. That's very basic primitive statistics. In addition to that, we need to also understand where we stand in the context of this genocide. Israel is very openly talking about a pending attack on Gaza City coming up. Gaza City is the largest Palestinian city in the occupied territories. It was the only Palestinian city to really survive the Nakba. Israel is promising to, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Katz, basically said, when this operation is complete, Gaza will change its face and will no longer look the way it did in the past. There have been other quotations from other military personnel who speak of leaving no building standing. According to the Israeli press, the expected ground push will not start before the beginning of next month, but they need to push out 1 million civilians out of Gaza to be able to do that, and they're trying to figure out how they can do that, bring in the UN. The central concept would be to surround Gaza City, to send in 4 major brigades, be careful in the areas where there's high rises, and before all of this, started off with a very heavy aerial bombardment before the troops actually move in. I would warn that the fight for Gaza City will be pivotal and seminal in this battle. Okay, it's not determinative, but it will be on the scale of, if it's fully carried through, of a kind of Stalingrad. I don't like to use the Stalingrad, but Stalingrad, it's not a Stalingrad insofar as that was 2 industrial, developed capitalist societies which were warring a major urban warfare against each other. Here we're talking about a refugee population fighting with very limited means against an advanced industrial society, but attempting a major urban warfare combat operation against this population and what it has attempted to prepare in terms of defenses. Okay, so we need to keep that in our sights for what's going on, but we also need to understand that even though I've said everything that I've said about how horrific the situation, there is also actually another side to all of this. I don't want to simply convey the horrors here. There is another story insofar as the way Gaza and the Palestinian population in Gaza has actually, it's something unbelievable how the people there have been able to attempt to resist, to remain steadfast, have not collapsed as a society, are self-organizing, are feeding themselves, and are also resisting. And these are heroes, I must say, and we need to acknowledge that, and we cannot forget that. I also want to say that as part of that, and folks in Gaza also very closely pay attention to this, is the question of what has happened in terms of the Palestinian movement outside. The struggle in Gaza, the steadfastness, the sumud, and the justice of the cause has also inspired millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, perhaps the major social movement of the 21st century, into a new social and political movement for justice around Palestine. And that is also not something to take lightly. We need to recognize it, we need to appreciate it, we need to reflect on it, how we can make it stronger. But it has slowed and weakened the genocide, but it has not been able to stop it. But we should also acknowledge it, because it's not just all doom and gloom in that sense, even though that kind of hope is a kind of defensive one. In any case, at the same time, it's difficult, and I speak as personally, and I'm sure many people in this room have the same feeling of exhaustion and of grief, and the feeling that we don't have time to even grieve. We do not, as I said, have the luxury of despair, nor do we have the luxury of any form of false hope. So the real question is, how do we approach this situation today? It is the moral and political test of our era, and this talk will attempt to sort of draw main lines of how we can, I believe. When we do this, I think the key starting point must be from a basic conviction that we are exactly where we are supposed to be. We are exactly where we are supposed to be. What does that mean? It's not what I want it to be. It's not what we're entitled to. It's not our rights. But it is where we are today is an accurate reflection of the true balance of forces going on in the world today. Not everything may be evident, but the reason why that statement might seem jarring is because there is a major disjuncture between what we feel Palestinians are entitled to and the horrors of what's happening, and the things like the fact that we have an international human rights law and human rights that have been recognized in many different places, but we have at the same time this horror show that's taking place here. So responsible political activity entails that we attempt to understand the reasons behind this disjuncture, because that will tell the true story of the true balance of forces, of the true interests, agendas, ideologies, praxis that enabled the Gaza genocide to happen. The Gaza genocide didn't fall from the sky. It didn't appear from nothing. It appeared from many different factors that have been gestating and ongoing for many years. And we need to identify those. Some of those are hidden. Some of those are not. Some of those are active. Some of those are passive. But we need to attempt to account for that, to be able to make a basis for how we might counter-organize and be more effective, not just to slow the genocide, but to bring justice in Palestine. Here, when I engage in that question, as a Palestine actor, somebody who studies the cause, somebody who has the privilege to travel across many different to many different countries and speak in contexts like this, I would argue there are 4 key disjunctures in understanding that account for why the situation looks the way it does. The first of these is essentially a misunderstanding or misconceptions around Israel, Zionism, and the nature of this state. It's not every country commits genocides like this either, in such open fashion, and thinks that they can get away with it, okay? Israel was and always has been a very particular type of entity, supposedly the Jewish state, attempting to implant it in the Arab East, in the Eastern Mediterranean. From its onset, although it argued that it was attempting some form of Jewish emancipation or self-determination, de facto it was a reactionary solution to the question of the Jewish question, of Europe, essentially. There is no way we can look at the genocide today and not look at the nature of Israel as a settler colonial project and as a project that was essentially reactionary to that, okay? One that said Jews cannot live with non-Jews. The answer to the Jewish question is Jewish self-determination and Jewish colonialism, basically. So we need to bring that question up. We need to reopen it because it relates to a whole set of questions related to the Jewish question, related to the European past, related to World War II. So I'll just put that out there as a start. Of course, it's not just that. You know, Palestinians refer to their context before the genocide started as al-Nakba al-Mustamirra. Al-Nakba is the catastrophe of 1948. It already committed ethnic cleansing in 48. And today it's practicing genocide because it wants to do ethnic cleansing. It prefers ethnic cleansing to genocide, but in the absence of ethnic cleansing, it's committing the genocide. But all of these derive from the core ideological, political foundations of this project as settler colonial, as embedded in a Western project for the region, and out of a kind of nationalism that was about blood and soil, okay? That was about Jews cannot live with non-Jews. It was essentially saying that racism is undefeatable, okay? And the answer is colonialism and Jewish self-determination. And by the way, it was the minority opinion within Jewish thought in Europe from the 1880s all the way up until World War II. 5 million Jews leave Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, after the assassination of Alexander II in 1882. Basically, you had the collapse of the Tsarist Empire as it was failing as an institution. 5 million Jews in these areas started to flee to Western Europe and the North America, South America, etc. Less than 1% went to Palestine. So it was actually not a popular project. And the majority of Jews in Europe were actually in favor of socialist solutions, in favor of forms of citizenship and forms of equality, and believed that that was possible. It was only the reactionary elements, the Zionist elements, that were emboldened by the fascistic, hard nationalistic tendencies that were taking place in the 20s and 30s, which combined with the imperial at the time to say, look, and found common interest in the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. So that's part one. The second axis that accounts for this disjuncture is the nature of the key allies of Israel and Israel's relationship to its key Western allies. Part of how Zionism was able to succeed was it was actually a failed project from the beginning, only until it gains the imperial backing, after Britain understands that a Jewish state and a loyal state in this area could be a protector of the road to India, did the Zionist movement become adopted by the Western powers. And they understood its utility. Today, the United States describes Israel as the aircraft carrier in the Middle East that cannot be sunk. You have the German chancellor, when Israel bombs Iran, he says they are doing the dirty work for us. He knows basically in the entire region there is Arab nationalism, there is an unfulfilled post-colonial situation in these territories. The Arab world still controls 4 key choke points of maritime trade that are essential between the East and the West: Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, and Straits of Hormuz. So as you have global dynamics taking place, and as the majority of global trade still travels is seafaring, these key points are key. So if you have national political Arab nationals of any sort, even liberal, you have a problem there. So the idea is basically to keep it divided and ruled through different forms of despotism, as well as Israel as the local disciplinary. Let's also not forget that the key backers of the genocide today are Germany, Britain, and the United States. All 3 countries, Germany committed a genocide against its Jewish population. The United States and Britain both rejected Jews during World War II when they were trying to flee. Okay? So this is also important to keep in mind. And I also don't want to let off the hook the Soviet Union in any sense, the actual birth of Israel. And to this day, the support of Russia today remains an important part of keeping Israel alive. Stalin had his people support the creation of Israel at the UN and recognize it. He also, during the key moment of the war with the Arabs in 1948, provided a key arms shipment. And to today, Putin has never really intervened in any sort of way to the benefit of the Palestinians. In fact, he speaks the other way around. He speaks, there are 2 million Russian Jews in Israel today, which was a kind of code for him to say that actually one day I would like Israel to be pro-Russia, basically, on our side. And you can find continuity in that line too. So part of the problem is, of course, this historical legacy of both West and East, or whatever the other bloc was, where both of them needed this foothold in the Middle East at the expense of the Palestinians and the Arabs overall. So basically, only by having Zionism be understood as a pawn of imperial powers, but also part and parcel of the national dynamics of the Jewish question in Europe and World War II, etc., this needs to be much more front and center in our analysis. The third aspect that accounts for the disjuncture has to do with what I would argue to be the local intra-Israel, Palestine-Israel conflict dynamics, as you might call it academically. As I said, we did not go from zero to genocide in one day. The last framing of the most recent framing of the context was what's known as the peace process. Let's not forget, in 1993, they gave the Nobel Prize to Rabin and Arafat. What is happening today is catastrophic. Was it a failure? Somebody has to account for the fact that a Nobel Peace Prize resulted in a genocide eventually 30 years later somehow, right? So now here, we basically need to demythologize what the peace process was for the last 30 years, okay? And when we do that, we come to understand that essentially the peace process arose out of the fact that Israel was actually in a fairly serious political dilemma in 1988, in the late 80s, when the Palestinian population launched the first Intifada, okay? Essentially, when Israel came to occupy the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, because the war was only 6 days, and the chief goal of it was to destroy pan-Arab nationalism and Nasser, it was not enough time for Israel to conduct mass ethnic cleansing. Plus, you had 20 years earlier the mass ethnic cleansing of the Nakba, written in the heads of the Palestinians who understood that Israel wanted to push them off the land. So even though Israel still was able to push out 500,000 Palestinians in 1967, over 1 million Palestinians remained in these territories. That essentially meant, over the last 55 years, meant that today you have a situation where 14 million people reside between the river and the sea, and they are half and half Jewish and Palestinians, with Palestinians having a higher birth rate. Israel always defined itself as a Jewish democratic state, but it was ruling over a population that was 50% Palestinian, essentially. So the answer to that was to redraw the map and to work towards what they called separation, okay? Now, this is, so the peace process was really a process of, because essentially, sorry, before I get to this, essentially, from 1967, Israel, believing in its national biblical mythology, ripped down all the walls between the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and even in the Golan Heights and in the Suez. It believed it had fulfilled a biblical prophecy and that it was entitled to these territories. But with the large Palestinian population who quickly entered the Israeli workforce, you had what you call in economics a process of convergence happening, where the economies and the populations of these territories, the Arab ones, the non-Jewish populations, were mixing, were learning Hebrew, were taking shekels, were taking that, the Israeli currency, were taking that money, raising the standard of living, building universities, building institutions, building national institutions, cultural institutions, and eventually began to demand political rights. Now, of course, the Palestinians were actually in the OPT, were waiting for the political rights from the PLO from outside to come in. But after the exodus of the Palestinians to Tunis in Beirut, the hope that a PLO army or whatnot could come and liberate Palestine was abandoned. And the PLO actually also changes its strategy itself to focus on the center of struggle coming from the territories themselves and the people themselves. So there was an effort at mass mobilization in the early 80s and the development of political national movement and party building, which today is the parties that are, which were the parties that actually led the first Intifada. This created the dilemma and pronounced it, because if Israel was to remain a Jewish democratic state, if it gave citizenship to the Palestinians, it would erode the, quote, Jewish character of the state. If it denied providing citizenship, it would erode the democratic character of the state. And this was a structural dilemma that Israel faced. Therefore, separation was essential. The Oslo process was about implementing that separation. The Americans understood that the historical moment had arisen after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the non-aligned movement and what happened in 1990, 1991 in the Iraq Gulf War, when the PLO was essentially made bankrupt and isolated in Tunis. They said, now is the moment to move. We can get the PLO to come in and play the role as an autonomy government to run what was a well-known plan amongst the Israelis to essentially modeled on the South African Bantustans, okay? Back in the day, I'm not sure how old people are here, but essentially, you know, when I was growing up in the 80s, Israel was very much considered to be a sister project of apartheid South Africa. They worked together, they built their nuclear projects together. They believed essentially in, you know, ethno-national rights for one people at the expense of another. And, they had already gone through apartheid South Africa and understood the stigmatization of making it look like a white majority rule sort of state. So Israel did a lot better job with its PR. And the Oslo process essentially was about building the institutions of self-government that enabled for the separation to look like a bona fide peace process, bona fide peace building, bona fide state building, and $50 billion of Western taxpayer money went to building this false chimera of a peace process, of a state building process, etc. It existed they built them in 2012, the IMF came out and said the Palestinian Authority has already built all the institutions needed for a state. What it lacked was sovereignty. Absent sovereignty, it was apartheid. And basically by the late 2015, 18, every single international rights organization had to conclude, Israeli, Palestinian, international, they all concluded that basically the situation from the river to the sea, not just in the West Bank, but from the river to the sea, was a form of apartheid, as apartheid is legally defined. So apartheid was the result of Oslo. Apartheid was what it was leading to, but at the same time, we cannot at the same time let off the hook. There was, I think, a lot of goodwill in and around the peace process from politicians or whatnot, but there was certainly there was also plenty of evidence that was coming out of the Palestinians, out of human rights organizations, having a sense of political history, that actually Israel and its ethno-national definition around Jewish state, etc., it was using and manipulating the peace process to enact autonomy, not sovereignty as the basis of the project. And essentially by the end of it, it had broken up the occupied territories, previously understood as one territorial unit, legalistically, broken it up into 156 different islands in the West Bank and Gaza, with Gaza being the largest of these islands. Normally, when we look at the map, We see the West Bank, we say, okay, that's much bigger, and you've got this little runt territory of Gaza down here, or whatever. The truth is the opposite. The truth is that the West Bank is divided into 155 different little islands where you have a Palestinian Authority that may or may not control schools or roads or whatnot, but still is under, Israel controls the higher ground in terms of what's let in and what's not let out, the people who enter, the money that enters, and at any moment Israel can enter and destroy, arrest, kill, do whatever it wants. And that is the situation. And the situation is that Gaza was the largest of the apartheid Bantustan islands created by the Oslo process. And as everyone also acknowledged well before October 7th, Gaza was an open-air prison, was essentially a concentration camp. It has 8 different United Nations refugee camps. They're 80% refugees from the 1948 war. And it was a toxic place, a toxic dump that was unfit for living, according to the United Nations, a declaration that came out in 2017 or 18, okay? So we need to, the third thing that we really need to internalize is to demythologize the peace process, the era, and understand the contributions of the peace process as an essential step in facilitating, laying the groundwork for the genocide to happen today, okay? In its mythology, in so many different aspects. Today, people still, I wrote my book called Palestine LTD, Limited. On the LTD part, I meant it in 2 senses. Limited because it was much smaller than Palestine historically, and limited like a limited shareholding company, okay? I won't go into the book too much, but the point is, people today, when they talk, they speak openly about Palestine and Israel. Well, where is Palestine and Israel? What are they talking about? Are we talking about Palestine from the river to the sea? Are we talking about the West Bank and Gaza? Are we talking about the areas where nobody knows, but the concept still has currency? You know, I mean, so you should define it when you do use it. But the point is, through these, they use the discourse of Palestine, state building, peace building, development, humanitarian aid, etc., this whole liturgy of liberal discourse, behind which was embedded true power, and who controlled it? It was the West and their military deep state mentalities, together with Israel and Zionism on the ground, and how they implemented it. So that's part 3 of the disjuncture. The fourth aspect that we really need to understand today has to do with the nature of the world order and the dynamics that are unfolding today. Because I think a lot of people have been shocked about the genocide and sort of like, how the hell is this possible in the 21st century, etc. Well, the truth is, we need to go back, we need to understand where we are in history today. In 2007, you had a major economic collapse which, had the state not intervened as it did, Ljubljana would not look like this. The entire Western, you would have mass poverty, you would have mass homelessness, because essentially we had 30 years of uninterrupted neoliberal ideology from 1990 all the way to, well, it wouldn't be uninterrupted, but it would be 1990, American unipolar hegemony, to 2007, basically, which was advocating that the market can answer everything. Okay, we don't need politics anymore, just create markets, Western style, neoliberalism, etc. Well, what happened was that system went off a cliff. They turned it, they made it absurd. They started, we know, I'm not going to go into what happened in the financial crisis, but basically it was all how much, you know, they were fixing markets, they were selling insurance and insurance of insurance and insurance of insurance of insurance, then getting everything triple graded, and giving people credit cards to buy houses. People didn't have jobs. The whole thing was tenuous. It was all a mass profit-making, attempt at mass profit-making and predation against poor people. Okay, neoliberalism changed the rules of so many different things, and it went off a cliff. And But when it went off a cliff, this is the important part, okay? This is the important part. When it went off a cliff, there was no ideology that ran the system, okay? Before, they used to claim the market is self-correcting. Just allow the banks to collapse. But what happened? Some banks collapsed, others were protected. Some sectors in the economy collapsed, others were protected. Some people lost their houses, others got to buy new houses because they got credits, they got money, they got etc., right? So somehow the bump of 2007 and the financial collapse that should have been like 1929 and much worse turned into a financial opportunity for the people who won out of the collapse of neoliberalism. Now that is hidden. You don't know that because you are not on the level of dealing with economics on that level. The insiders of the system understood that actually what it really meant is those who won out from that process were the people who had influence, who had power with the system. There was the point is it was political. It was relational, those who succeeded, okay? And essentially, obviously, it hurt poor people, right? So why is that important? Because that is the basis of the past 15 years or so, or more, whatever, I guess 17 years, where there has been no ideology that is running the system. The insiders know what's going on about it, and the people on the ground sort of feel slowly but surely the erasure of, it's not really clear what's going on. But this is also the basis of the new populism and the new fascism and the collapse of the liberal center, okay, that we witnessed all across Europe, because the liberal center brought neoliberalism forward, but also failed, basically. So now it's become a competition between the right, the center right, or the left that went right, and now potentially new progressive movements on the left that are attempting to come to power in different places, but that's another story. But the point is, that is the new global order that we are going through right now, okay? It is about power, it is about connections. How does that influence what's happening in Gaza, though? It influences it because Israel was uniquely positioned after 9/11, and for many other reasons before it, but certainly 9/11 gave it a lot of advantages and steps ahead from others, to pose itself as the answer to the Western dilemma and crisis of capitalism, a crisis that was also becoming apparent in geopolitics with the rise of the BRICS and the rise of China and deindustrialization in the West. We had China talking about its Belt and Road project, its attempt to move westward, and the West trying to keep China on that side. You have today a situation where essentially GDP of the Western bloc, what Samir Amin used to call the triad, representing around 29% of global production. But the BRICS today are already 36%. So actually, you have declinism taking place in the West. And so we are on the decline in the West. You have ascendant powers, other powers, and this is also problematic from a Western capitalist perspective. So in this context, Israel said, the answer is, come to us. We are your people. We know how to get out of this. And it wasn't just them. I'm not trying to be conspiratorial about it, but they were well positioned to be the answer for Western crisis of capitalism. They did that by arguing that Israel can be a producer of natural gas. We can diversify Europe's fuel dependency, help it move away from Russia and Ukraine by extracting both Israeli gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also there's a lot of other gas. Egypt, Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, Syria, Lebanon. There's gas all over Gaza. There's gas all over the place, okay? Why did Germany give Israel nuclear-powered submarines in 2006? It did it because they want them to be the local lord of the Eastern Mediterranean, okay? And we saw that immediately once Ukraine happened. So hydrocarbons was a part of it. Of course, Israel always has been a major purveyor of weapons, and certainly with the digitization shift and AI and surveillance and new technologies of information became forms of power, and with the internet turn broadly understood, Israel was well positioned because it had developed all these technologies to control and manage the Palestinians after Oslo. Actually, that's the interesting part there. Actually, the Western world helped when they developed the Palestinian statistics, when the Western world developed Palestinian ministries, one way they gave the most money and really developed actually a good ministry was actually the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics. There was no information on the occupied territories that was Israel considers West Bank, they call it Judea and Samaria, you know, and they never used to distinguish it because they said it's Israel, it's none of your business what it is, you know, this is the part of the Israeli economy. When they created Oslo and they created the Palestinian Authority areas, they needed the information. And anyway, Israel has, it's no secret Israel as a startup nation and developed incredible means of surveillance and monitoring, et cetera, that helped in forms of population control and repression. So in these ways, essentially Israel was able to pitch and posit itself as a core answer to Western liberal crises, geostrategically, economically, and in terms of security doctrines. So it is these four elements that I would argue today that explain the main drivers of the genocide, but also explain this disjuncture and the shock effect that we get of how the fuck does a genocide happen in this way every day after day, and we can't do anything about it, and we have this great, you know, human rights law, and it's never really being abided by, etc. So let's also not forget that just before October 7th, the Biden administration had also explained that its answer to China was going to be India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, strategic trade, information, fuel corridor to keep the Chinese at bay over there and to have the Indians counterbalance the Chinese extension westward, shall we say. So that was what was going on, and that's what October 7th interrupted. And that's what very clearly Trump is talking about going back to, and that's why he wants Gaza as a form of real estate. So it is only after a realignment of our understanding of the real forces at play, the real dynamics, the real agendas, can we really begin to understand the real struggles and how we are supposed to organize ourselves today. And sort of this brings me to the last final thing to sort of wrap up. Here we see many issues that not only affect Gaza and Palestine, but affect all of us. On one level, it's very simple and very obvious to say the violation of international human rights law and laws of war are damaging to all of us. Yes, okay, great. They always needed an implementation mechanism that they lacked, and that was always interpreted. So there were always problems with the old system. And it's important to acknowledge that, yes, that's correct. Nobody is implementing these laws, and when you have a case like Ukraine and Gaza taking place at the same time, the contradiction in the application of this law is very apparent and obvious and sickening at the same time. But it is not just about Gaza, and this is what I want to say. Of course, I already made the point that the peace process came out of Western tax money. You already paid for this. They used your good faith, your goodwill in a peace process, your tax money, and used it to build apartheid. But it's not just that. Israel today is banking, if it is to be successful in the genocide, it must invert the entire post-war rules-based order itself and make fascism fashionable again. There's no other way around it. There's no other way around it. And that's what, therefore they are making a bet on a new kind of future, a new world order that is already penetrating our societies today in the West. And here I want to show very concrete examples of this. In Italy, Meloni was recently caught up in a scandal where she was taking Israeli technology and it came out that she was using it. So what is this fucking Israeli technology? It means that these phones, somebody can have this phone with their technology over there at the statue, and they are directing it at this room, at everybody in this room, and they are looking at your pictures, they're looking at what you like, what you don't like, they're who you dated, you know, all your secrets, you know, they have, it is at a world at their fingertips. Information is power in capitalism, okay? And the technologies of digitization is a kind of power that never existed in human history. We don't understand it because we never imagined it. It was sci-fi, but it's here already. So we see it in places like Italy where it's, you know, she's using it against anti-immigration activists and she's using it against journalists. We see it in the United States where some of the surveillance technology is being sold to real estate agents who are using it to monitor poor people in housing projects that have very particular agreements that say how many people can live in the house or not to be able to be entitled for poor housing. If they can monitor and figure out that this person in this rent-controlled housing that should be worth much, much more is actually abusing the rights, abusing his contract, then actually he can be kicked out. And the landlord can get the building and sell it at market price or rent it at market price, etc. So it's being used in cases like real estate and gentrification and changing neighborhoods. Of course, everyone knows Israeli technology is being used in immigration and monitoring borders. We all have a very clear sense of it in the social media sphere with shadow banning and whatnot. And the manipulation that we see there. We recently saw in the Gaza genocide how Google, Amazon, Microsoft, all of them went out of their way and provided services and facilitation and made deals with Israel to allow the genocide to happen. Even Microsoft, did you see this in the Guardian? It's quite crazy. They actually went to an independent firm to confirm that their information, they were providing cloud sharing, incredible cloud sharing, what they were doing. A cloud sharing ability that allowed them to monitor and translate 1 million telephone calls per minute. The entire population of Gaza. So everything you say and do would be monitored and heard, etc. Every day when you're sitting on your toilet, the thing could be watching you if they want it, okay? So it's a kind of penetration that we don't realize, and we expect, oh, we're in social democracy, we're protected. You're not protected anything. You're not protected at all. So between surveillance, no, hold on. So Microsoft went to an independent consultant to affirm that its facilitations for the Israeli army were not affecting civilians, and they said, don't worry about it, it's all cool. But I mean, that could only be possible with, you know, I mean, in bad faith, because every 2,000-pound bomb in a place like Gaza is going to wipe out, you know, dozens of buildings at a time. If you see the buildings in Gaza, they built refugee camps. Every 6 people was put in 3 by 3 meter cinder block homes. And then they built on top of these, the refugees thereafter, to create the bigger houses. But think what a 2,000-pound bomb will do in that situation. And the idea that you are going to target a single militant by doing that. And to do it again and again and again and again. That's why it's genocide. They use the security excuse, oh, there's Hamas, we've got to take them out, etc. But, and the collateral damage, okay, they knew their own statistics are already saying 83% are civilian from their own statistics. And, so there's nothing to say anymore. The point is, this brave, and I will say cowardly, new world that is being made aware to the world today that we see in Gaza is already developing here. When I spoke in Zagreb, I called the talk Gaza Guernica. See that up there, Guernica. Guernica was the prelude to World War II. It was the prelude to the fight between fascist forces and partisans. It showed what aerial bombardment against the civilian population could do, and the massacres. And had Guernica gone differently, the world might have been different. That is the same today with Gaza. If the Gaza genocide is allowed to happen, if this movement, these tendencies, these dynamics are able to continue, it will hollow out our democracy. It will hollow out our social welfare. It will hollow out our privacy. It will hollow out our freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of academic freedom. It will entrench Islamophobia. It will entrench anti-immigration sentiments. It will entrench anti-Semitism. It will entrench anti-Semitism because it is far easier to find a scapegoat in a Jewish conspiracy than it is to look at Western capitalism and your local elites. That is what this is about. So that is where the question of hope comes from, I would argue, because we know what they are going to do. They have said what they are going to do. The question now is, what are we going to do? What is our plan when they go after Gaza City? We have to understand the larger historical dynamics that are at play and to understand that the sacrifices of Gaza are part of a set of sacrifices to defend elementary principles of solidarity, of humanity, of human rights, of the accomplishments that we had and the sacrifices of our past. The partisans already fought here to defeat fascism. Do we have to fight it again, is the question. If Gaza passes, it will be a lot easier for fascism to run amok across Europe and the West, and we already see it happening. So those are the stakes. We know what they're doing. Do we know what we are doing? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Toufic. I promised you density. And after everything you delivered, I have a few questions, but I'll start with one, and then hopefully people from here can connect to that question or ask any other question that you might be interested in after hearing Toufic speaking. When you talked about the genocide drivers, as the first one, you've mentioned the misconception and misunderstanding of Zionism, Israel, and the whole construct of this specific ideology that has been driving genocide and many other violences connected to it. And then you spoke about the second one, and that was the European colonial project and the way, or maybe it was connected to this European colonial project that just sort of couldn't stand Jews living anymore in the territories of Europe, but had to get rid of that population to fulfill some of its economic interests and the other ones. And so I think in many ways, I would say for us who are interested in Palestinian question and who are following this, I think we have this general understanding. And I would say there is a wide acceptance of this genocide drivers that you've mentioned. But I think there is a part of the argument where there is sort of a slippery slope that we have to talk about. And that is that the anti-Semitism that existed and still exists, but existed in Europe before and during the Second World War, had to find its counter project, which for many progressive minds was acceptance of Zionism, and seeing Zionism as a very progressive ideology. And so Leandras Fischer, you know, a few years ago, he published a book, and he recently spoke in Zagreb and talked not only about the extreme minds and the right-wing political parties and, you know, men and structures with bad intent accepting Zionism, but he talked actually about this becoming the project of the left. And so Die Linke and leftist organizations and political parties such as Možemo in Zagreb, for instance, and I would say to an extent the left government and left politicians that we saw during this festival too, they have been adopting the very idea of Israel's necessity to exist, and for the two-state solution to live as the most progressive solution. And it seems to me that is something that in our spaces here, in our geographies with our political histories, oftentimes becomes so easily accepted that we need to have space for everyone, so everybody deserves their own state in a sense. There could be potentially 5 different questions coming from this comment, but I would like you to maybe open our eyes about a two-state solution. This has been discussed so much over the past few weeks with Slovenian government recognizing Palestine, with so much pressure coming from different progressive left pro-Palestinian groups on different European governments, including the Croatian one, to recognize Palestine. What harm might we be doing with that?
Thank you for the multi-layered question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's firstly important to, bring in some of the history in terms of how obviously support for Zionism after from the mid-40s onwards was sort of a quick and easy way for the West to sort of not really take account for what had happened and to quickly shift gears. If you remember what happened, basically, the Holocaust had just happened, and actually it was not anymore about defeating fascism, it was about the new Cold War that had developed. So the attempt at quote-unquote denazification was largely symbolic, and then the West began to handpick and allow for the renormalization of ex-Nazis in Western Germany as part of the Cold War. Now, that's pretty important, okay? Because then they became hardcore Israel supporters. The actual aid that Germany starts giving to Israel, and that was actually a very controversial deal between the Germans and the Israelis after World War II, but actually was also a plan to prime and to build German military industrial complex post-World War II, particularly its naval, because Israel wanted ships to be a naval power, and Germany wanted to rebuild its military, actually. And so the aid that Germany gives to Israel is actually to rebuild the German military industrial complex, to not look at the bullshit of denazification, to not look at what Nazism was about, and the fact that Germany had essentially attempted to solve its minority question through Holocaust, and had also, the entire West had displaced the Jewish question onto the Arabs, into Palestine, and making them the victims of it. So there's all that sort of question of convenience that need to be opened up and talked about. The question then becomes about the two-state solution. Now, the two-state solution is obviously, has a complicated set of origins to it. From a Palestinian perspective, I think it is also misunderstood. When the PLO accepted two-state solution, they said, look, let's end the occupation. That's the basic thing that you can do. However, they never, and they always asserted, and this is important because it tends to be, Yeah, people don't acknowledge it because it's more convenient to acknowledge the other thing, which is that basically the PLO said we are still support the right of return. Okay, now that might seem contradictory because basically the majority of Palestinians are from the territories of what's today Israel, right? Like the ethnic cleansing, the people in Gaza are all from the lands and 250 villages in southern Palestine. Okay, but the PLO believed, they believed those two rights could coexist in that framework, but maybe we need to be staged about it. And they were supported by the Arab, particularly the Gulf regimes, who sponsored Fatah and encouraged it, particularly after 1973 war, to essentially go down the liberal international rules-based order and go through the UN, we will back you, we will pay for you, but please don't pull out those guns, okay? And they supported Fatah because Fatah always had a non-ideological character to it. They openly claimed that they would not intervene in the internal political and class matters inside Arab society. That was not what the left was doing. The left was calling for Arab revolution, getting rid of the despotic leaders, getting rid of feudalism, getting rid of whatever. It was part of the sort of mishmash of left ideas that was coming out of the radical lefty, whatever, third world type movements, which the PLO was one of them. So the reactionary feudal Arab states said, look, we'll pay you whatever you want, take over the PLO, but just go down the international order, accept 242, go down that order and put the gun away. So it took 20 years for the PLO to do that, basically, and a lot of political weakness and miscalculations, but essentially to get to the table that allowed for Oslo to happen. But as I said, Fatah never gave up the right of return, but believed that slowly but surely, until today, Fatah has an extreme conservative ideology where they essentially say, we don't need to fight the Israelis with guns. The role of militarism is over. We need simply to remain Palestinian on our land, and that eventually, over time, will come back to us. Because it's enough that we are non-Jews here, basically. We will contradict Zionism that way and eventually be able to get our rights. That is Fatah's approach. They do not declare it, but they also say, look, you convinced us, you told us, go down the international route. We did it. We put away the guns. We built the authority. We even went after Hamas in the beginning, and you didn't deliver. You didn't give us that state. You didn't back us up in negotiations, but we're still here, and we're still willing to go through that process. And that's their project in the West Bank. And that is where Europe in particular, because Europe paid for the peace process. The Americans didn't pay for it. The Europeans paid for it, and Europe paid a higher price for it. There was more movements here that were demanding it. America didn't have any movements that were demanding Palestinian rights, most of its history. Europe was more vulnerable because of the oil, so it backed that two-state approach nominally. However, it also turned its eye to the reality that the fact that the two-state solution was being hollowed out day by day through Israel's expansionism and settler colonialism. And just in the last 2 days, when Israel declared that it is building in the E1 territory, you know how the West Bank goes like this? That middle part is Jerusalem, where the tightest, it's the thinnest part of the West Bank. The E1 plan is exactly this area. So they built a settlement at the eastern part of it, called Ma'ale Adumim, which has 25,000 people in it, but it has a municipal size 5 times the size of Tel Aviv, and now they are going to link it to Jerusalem and build demographically settlements in that area, which permanently make the two-state solution impossible. Okay, so, okay, I don't know, I want to come back to the question somehow, but as long as there is good faith, there is an interpretation of two states that could have potential good faith aspects to it. But at this stage, it is only something that, you know, that is used as a tool of obfuscation, basically. And it is
of course, very problematic because, you know, the concept of the Jewish state, which would be one of the two states, would mean that it would enable Israel to actually expel another 2 million Palestinians who are non-Jews inside Israel, okay? And then from a Palestinian perspective, also, if you recognize Israel having any form of real sovereignty, then actually then they can determine their borders and they can prevent refugees from returning, which is also a problem. So you're going to keep the conflict going longer term. And so, I mean, the truth is we need to focus on building movements that go back to the core elements of this, because Palestinian liberation is not going to be won in the context of Israeli-Palestinian relations. It can only be won in the context of a much broader Arab as well as Western progressive mass movement that says this ideology, forget about it. It's over. It's not an answer to the Jewish question. It's a disaster. It's colonialism. It's apartheid again. It's South Africa again. And it needs to be ended. And all the questions that are surrounding it, including reopening World War II, need to be reopened, basically. And it's, by the way, it's already as a project, it's actually failing. Like, I mean, you could say it's succeeding, but what is the success of this state? Already you have 700,000 Israelis just in the last 2 years leaving. 40 to 50% of the population has other passports. There was a major globalization wave that happened after Oslo where, you know, the Ashkenazi elite of Israel basically went back to Berlin and Florida and London and bought properties and did what it's the main issue in Israel is what to do with how has Netanyahu been able to stay in power? He's only been able to stay in power because he collected the victims, the Jewish victims of Zionism, believe it or not, and to create a stable political coalition against the initiators of the Ashkenazi elite who set up the state. And because they have less options, they're more ideologically fascistic and have different frameworks that have nothing to do with liberalism, that they think they can move forward the project in the cynical, perverse project of New World Order, surveillance state, whatever, get rid of liberalism. And what they're doing now, what they're trying to normalize now is some sort of security doctrine or whatever the hell they're doing.
Now, you've opened up new layers, but I'll come back to my question and maybe just try to center it around your topic, you know, the Gaza being between despair and hope. If we could just nuance this a little bit, and maybe if you could answer, what is Palestine gaining with current recognitions? Are the recognitions in any way going to stop the genocide? And I just need to remind us all here that while the recognitions are happening, the states are planning new shipments of weapons to Israel. So I would just like maybe to have, you know, some sort of, given that this is a concerted political intervention, as you mentioned, I would like to have, if we could come out from this conversation with some sort of clarity and instruction, at least for the leftist movements, from the left political parties, for the progressive minds and, you know, intellectual labors that are being done in these spaces. It is a mistake that one should not be doing if we are doing the mistake. You know what I mean? So what is Gaza, what is Palestine gaining from current recognitions?
Recognitions like recognition of the state. Yes, the new recognitions that have taken place. So on one level, recognition of statehood has a degree of, you know, okay, it's a form of political recognition. What it does de facto is it pronounces the contradictions of, like, okay, now you're recognizing us as a state or whatever, but actually still there's a genocide, still there's apartheid, still there's colonialism. So who cares, right? The truth is, so the recognition issue should not be used as a dummy to sort of say, okay, we did our part, and then shrug your shoulders again. The truth is, we need to be doing everything we can through parliamentary means and through extra parliamentary means, because the parliamentary means have already failed us. I don't want to throw them entirely out, and I don't want to, each context is going to be different. We've seen legislations and parliaments in different parts of the world, including in Europe, that have done some important things, including in Slovenia. But the truth is, we have a genocide happening. Genocides are irreversible. It's not like you go back, so okay, let's do a do-over, we fucked that up again. No, people are dead, right? Like histories are dead, archives are dead, etc. So we don't have and I don't know anyone in Gaza who was saying recognize the Palestinian state. You know, like by the way, it's even more pronounced in Gaza because for Gazans it's like. For them, it's about return, right? Like they want to go back to Palestine. They want to go back to their lands, right? And the problem for them was that they were in Gaza to begin with. Not that Gaza wasn't a state, but that they're in Gaza and that they could see their land in the kibbutzes, which they went to on October 7th, which was their land, which you know, these kibbutzes, they became, you know, Nahal Oz, kibbutz had 400, 300 people in it, controlling 20 square kilometers of land that all belonged to people in Jabalia, you know. So, you know, this very profound, like, stark injury and grievousness while you and for 77 years you're receiving handouts from the United Nations, living in this toxic dump and being told all this nonsense about statehood and all this stuff. And on the other side of the fence, you have this sort of, you know, hedonistic, sort of, you know, bohemian Zionist mythology of the kibbutzniks, right? Like, which mesmerized the world left for decades. That mythology is gone, and we need to continue getting rid of that mythology. But the point is, to bring it back, it's a genocide, and all hands on deck. We need to organize ourselves and to analyze the situation, to research the situation, and to elevate our forms of resistance so that we can meet what, you know, how are we going to face this situation? It's a very serious thing, and that's why I would say that we are at the stage of direct action and more at this stage. And in fact, Richard Falk, like the UN special representative, basically said that pretty much, you know, under international law, you're pretty much entitled even to take armed action against Israel at this stage. He said it, not me. Okay, he said it. Okay, so I'm not here to advocate one form of technique or another. It's up to local actors to understand where things stand and what's possible in each area. But at the same time, you know, the alarm bell needs to be rung, because we can't just keep on saying like genocide, genocide, genocide as though it's like crying wolf. It's happening every day. The statistics I said are happening every day. And what is about to happen in Gaza will be much, much worse. So we need to prepare ourselves and prepare those forces and test where, ultimately, you know, my own, ultimately, it should be up to the workers are the ones who actually can stop the system. Not everybody has the same points of leverage that others have, though. So, you know, a country like Slovenia is not quite the same like the US or the UK. The real struggle today is in Germany and in the UK and the US. But also this EU project, you guys have a finger in it. You know, at the very least, of course, don't facilitate arms or whatnot. But research is important. We need to map and understand all the main positions, hard and soft, that are facilitating the false ideologies that lead to this disjuncture, that lead to the genocide. And our movement has already has started that process, but it needs to consolidate, it needs to think reflexively as a movement and bring those energies together and not fall into despair, but reconnect it to how Gaza is the litmus test for their own social and political movements and their own futures, their families' futures, their past, as well as the environment. Because also because really what's happening now is Europe and the West to confront their the crisis of liberal capitalism's demise is basically initiating a form of military Keynesianism that will restructure the social contract across Europe
and say, look, you know, whatever, the Russians are here, we've got to do it, sorry, you know, we're going to have to cut your housing or whatever. You have incredible society here. I mean, we come here, we see this, I don't know, you guys live here. I don't want to say that this is a perfect society. I'm sure there's a lot of problems here and et cetera, but you have very important gains. They are under threat if the winds of this false logic are able to continue. And so that's why Gaza is so important. Do it not just for Gaza, but also for yourselves.
Thanks so much for this. Let's open up the discussion with people sitting over here. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much for this wonderful insights that you gave us and this wonderful opportunity to hear you speak. I want to take it back to capitalism and the crisis of capitalism. I have like sort of two questions that connect together. First one is related to the work of Jason W. Moore. Maybe you are familiar with his work. He has written for Verso a book called Capitalism in the Web of Life. His hypothesis is that the new crisis of capitalism is based on the fact that there is very little primary resources left to extract from. So in order for capitalism to reproduce itself, it needs to destroy and rebuild, which is what we see happening in Ukraine and now Gaza, and we also see it happening in Sudan. And it's my estimate based on this that it's going to get only worse. And to connect that is MS Zer's boomerang effect with these surveillance technologies which are coming back now to Europe, that are imported by European governments from Israel, including my own government in Serbia, the authoritarian regime that we have there that is actively cooperating and collaborating with Israel. And my second question is, because you mentioned workers, it's related to how very little on the left we still speak of the potential of the class struggle. What is the potential of the class struggle and how we can harness the class division that Israel has created within its own Jewish population? And is there like some kind of like level of awareness among the Israeli Jews about the class division that exists there? And because my understanding of the class division that exists there is basically racialized, and it's racialized among the Jews themselves based on the hierarchy of who is the Jew, the appropriate Jew, that the Ashkenazi Jew, the Arab Jews are erased, the identity of Arab Jews is erased. So I'm just like wondering what is the potential of the class struggle and how we can actually utilize this in our resistance to the fascism that is rising and growing everywhere, even in India as we see it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this question. Given the time we have for this conversation, would like to see if there are any related questions, anything that connects to the critique of capitalism, potential of worker struggle, class struggle, anything related to that. Did you want Charlie? No, okay.
So it's difficult for me to comment about this book or whatnot. I mean, that's part and parcel of capitalism, right? Using the world and its resources as an indefinite, expendable resource until we're all choking and there's no forests and whatever, right? And then they shrug their head and they're living in Switzerland anyway, and we're all fucked. That's basically the model, right? There is some new work that's coming out. Andreas Malma came out with this book called The Destruction of Palestine, The Destruction of the World or something like that. I haven't read it, but it's basically an attempt to introduce political ecology into the analysis and because, that's why I brought up the question of military Keynesianism and actually the permanent arms economy, because basically that's the model. Everybody's going to be like, oh, we've got to get more nationalists and develop local weapons industries, which is dependent upon oil, which is dependent, war is one of the most destructive aspects of capitalism, obviously, and of the environment, etc. So there's definitely needs to be more work on that, but I'm not sure what the question is. You did ask about the boomerang effect of the thing. Now, this is the interesting part about it. Who's getting boomeranged? Because when I see Netanyahu up there and he's so arrogant and he's like, you know, he speaks with this blah, 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 and he does all this stuff. Part of his arrogance is he knows what those technologies do and can do, okay? And he knows what he wants to do is he wants to go to Europe in every country and say, look, you know, I understand maybe you don't like what we're doing here and there, whatever, but I also understand that you've got problems and that you have competition in your societies or whatnot. Why don't you take this technology and see what the other party is doing? See what your competition is doing. And the fact is, these technologies are really, really important. You know, they can. It's already well known that Israeli officers are breaking off from their military industrial complexes, going to northern Turkey, setting up like shell companies, selling this technology to Mexican drug lords, to, you know, Gulf sheikhs who end up cutting up journalists, you know, or going to Maloney and giving it so they can, you know, just get rid of her local, you know, just for a cheap, going after local journalists. I mean, there was some woman who spoke today who basically said she had Pegasus on her phone or whatever, and it's obviously being used in Serbia. Information is power, and you don't know about it if you don't know the information, you don't have the power. And then you're like, oh shit, I lost. You know, I lost competitively in an election or anything. But actually, that loss was engineered. That loss, you don't know what happened behind the curtain, okay? I'm not trying to be conspiratorial. It's here. We know it's here. So it's not just a boomerang, yani. It's like there's key elements who can, these technologies, if given to key elements in local society, can tip the balance of certain political struggles, commercial struggles, many different things, and they can use. We saw how it happened in the elections. You saw the Cambridge Analytica stuff when Trump and, you know, they have, every person in this room has 5,000 pieces of information that are already accessible, on the, you know, publicly accessible, whatever. That's the publicly accessible. Now we're going to get into your cell phone and get into your guts and your underwear and whatever. That's basically what it's about. So, you know, it's a dangerous new world order, basically. That's why I say it's hollowing out our democracy, our freedoms, our progressive values, whatever. But they believe they can do that. But it can be, as long, if it's selectively done, it can have huge effect, and we might not know about it. That's the point. And that's what I understand he's doing. And that's how I understand he's going to align a new right-wing movement by handing these either information or technologies into those hands, and whatever, and it becomes a, you know, what's it called? You know, a relationship, symbiotic relationship between the two. Basically, you scratch mine, I scratch yours, and we're all happy. You know, and who's screwed, we know. You know, extraneous people will need to be gotten rid of in the middle, but it's okay, yani. So that was the first question. The second had to do with Israeli class struggle. To be very frank, you know, I'm part of a Marxist tradition that basically doesn't, you know, there of course is a working class in Israel, including parts of it that are Jewish, but you know, it is heavily racialized. But because the overarching structure of the society is settler colonial, and because it's about setting up the Jewish state, etc., they're basically, the Israeli working class is the benefactor of this supremacist project. It's not, you know, they don't have any objective interest in eliminating their privilege. And I'm not somebody who likes to talk about privilege, like, because I don't believe in identity politics and that sort of privilege stuff in that way. I believe it's not to the working class's advantage that, you know, that we define. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, the answer to the Jewish question is
is opening a much larger set of politics related to World War II and also related to what happened since 48, of course, because the Arab Jews as well need to have an answer for them as well. So in that regard, that's why I'm not just opposed to a two-state solution, but I'm also opposed to a one-state solution. The entire region was divided by colonial powers. It has no basis to it. Largely, it's just run through. So I'm much more in belief of a socialist federation across the Middle East, which would be able to answer that, and solve the Jewish question. But it will take time. And we're not there yet. But we need to put it in our imaginaries. But we don't need to put hopes in some sort of Israeli working class that could potentially stand up and support Palestinian rights. It's going in the exact opposite direction, the direction which says actually the answer is for us to eliminate these damn Gazans and these damn Arabs and whatever, and and to go that. My argument was around the international working class, and particularly the Western working class, which needs to also, which, if it were organized, if it, could strangle production, could stop movement of things through direct forms of confrontation, and in that regard, let me actually underline that part, because those are collective forms of action, which are much more effective than individual ones, and which forms of militarism might tend towards, okay, in terms of, so collective action is really what we need. And actually, we already have won many of the political and sympathy sides of our argument, but what we haven't done is we haven't translated the masses that have come out to the streets. We don't want another damn Iraq war situation where we have millions on the streets, but then it stops. Why does the working class have to be in that situation? Why can't it find the tools and the means of leverage, of traction? We need to study, we need to elevate our game, basically. But that's a slow process that, I don't know. It's been buffered by the quote-unquote comfort of social democracy, basically, in the past years. But don't take that for granted, So, the initial socialist and radical ideas came out of extreme hardship, and the traumas of urbanization and landlessness and poverty and economic collapse and all that stuff, So, and the socialization of the trauma and the collective grievance and the existence of real radicals who said, fuck this ruling class, we need to bring the guillotine back, or we need to storm the Crystal Palace or whatever, those were there. The problem is we've had 30 years of neoliberalism, and everybody thinks it's going to come back. Everybody thinks it's, this is just a blip on the scene. It's actually, no, it's not. It's much more endemic, the problem that we're in. It's much more serious. This declinism is much more serious. Let alone, there's no ideology to it, and they're losing out to the West. And they globalized all the freaking money, all the deindustrialization, taking it to China and the cheapest places where labor was in the world, and then all these shell companies basically allowed the money to disappear. So it's not a part of our tax base anymore. So they're only strangling you guys. You pay, just pay. The money is in fucking Google. They're making the billions every year. That's where it is. Taxes, it's the basis, whatever. So, and then we also have this crazy phenomena, which is high-tech capital, which didn't exist as a capitalist, we used to have the industrial, capitalism was never unified. There was the agricultural elite, the industrial elite, there's the trading elite, there's the finance elite, right? They all have different interests and they all operate in certain ways. These high-tech guys who 20 years ago didn't exist, today are almost trillionaires. They control our lives. They want to go to Mars. They want to, they want to reproduce their own, whatever, clone themselves or something. They don't believe in democracy. You're all expendable. One day, Musk is a friend of Trump, and they're going to save America or whatever. The next day, he has a fight with him. He's like, oh, you're a pedophile. Okay, so what was it? Yesterday, what was the problem? Why were you hanging out with a pedophile yesterday? You know what I'm saying? It's in our face, and the working class is shocked at it. Shocked.
our organizations aren't prepared, haven't been prepared. So we need to wake up, and it's not just waking up from the blood of Gaza and that coffee, but it's all that too, basically. So we need to weave all that together in a much more cohesive political narrative that has organizational traction. Parliamentary and ex-parliamentary, but with focus on ex-parliamentary, because the parliamentary has already failed and is linked to the old liberal collapse.
Any other questions, perhaps? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, I just brings me some thought now when you are talking about high-tech capitalism and so on. And there's a web page, we all know about it, boycott. So boycott companies that are working with Israelis and so on, and are connected with genocide. And on this list is also, for example, Google, Microsoft, also Booking, Airbnb, but I cannot boycott them. I'm dependent on them. And the next question now is for me, what will happen if they start to boycott me? What will happen with me?
Good question, very important question. Very, very important question. It's not easy to boycott Microsoft 365 when you go and work on it every day, or Google when you need to do a search or whatnot. I don't have all the answers. I do know that they're complicit in a genocide. I do know there are workers there that are potentially organizable. I don't know if that's where I'm going to start. I know they fired a bunch of workers who did try to organize. I do know they probably care about their reputations a little bit, because they used to enjoy kind of, we're like, I remember when the internet was fun, it's like the potential of the world, like whatever, we can see anything and whatever, go anywhere through this internet business or whatever. And all of a sudden, a brave new world, like the mask is off, and like Elon Musk is behind there doing who knows what, right? Like, so it's a scary, I don't have the answer to it. It's a question that I'm not alone to answer it, but I think we have an obligation to ask the questions. We have it, and they can be weakened. They can be called out. You can do forms of direction action against them, and you would be justified, and you can build campaigns around them. And they would have to respond to it at some point if you got your masses up. Part of the issue, though, is there is no on one level. There's no sort of knockout punch in this whole system. It's very messy. It's a swamp that we're in, right? Because we're so imbricated and entangled in this new world. And that which makes it very dangerous. On the other hand, also, we surrendered our independent organizations a long time ago. How many people are militants in organizations who are saying, look, fuck this global capitalism, we need to organize around it? Very few people, but maybe you'll find that. But we might need to rebuild those parties, basically. Not necessarily parties, or organizations, and that's what this is about. Building consciousness, organizing consciousness. And here I think we need to sort of be very careful, because we have limited resources. We have to select our targets very carefully. I'm not sure if we need to start with Microsoft, this big behemoth in one of the biggest companies in the world. It might be better just to start with, I don't know a Slovenian example, but like the Zionists in America or in London, there's still, there's settler groups there, there's things, those are very obvious fascistic organizations that are selling settlements and maybe selling arms or whatever. That's something you might be able to build something around. And like, when the tide rises, the Microsoft people will get the hint, kind of thing. But, you have to build, there's no one hit wins all, I would say. It's going to be a dialectic.
I can't see Stephanie Westbrook here with us. These lights are kind of killing me, but I think Stephanie's not here. Stephanie spoke on a panel this afternoon, and she spoke about the boycott and where can it be functional. And recently, in a Zoom conversation where Stephanie and Omar Barouti spoke, they said that for, boycott is very important to be both ethical and strategic. And while it is very much impossible to ignore Google because it kind of, defines a lot of our work processes, we can still use Google options or channels to do our work of organizing and confronting the system. It might sound paradoxical, but at the same time, we just can't do otherwise because Google doesn't have an alternative at this point. The other speaker who was here today, the artist from Lebanon, her name is Sabina. Sabina spoke about the discomfort of boycotting and the irrationality behind that discomfort. And I think they said, you can boycott Spotify, it's kind of easy. The only reason why you don't, or why we don't, is our comfort. So I'm like the same with Airbnb and Booking. I don't think it's the same as Google, for instance, or Microsoft. So I would just say, look at the PACB website, boycott, BDS website. I think, they also provide some sort of guidance around how to choose who to boycott and what does it mean to be ethical and strategic at the same time. I think we're going to come to a close. It's almost 10 p.m. and we have been conversing, discussing, and inspiring and conspiring here for the last 12 hours. So if you guys want to talk to Toufic, I guess I can say this freely, maybe you can approach him now or maybe tomorrow or Sunday, I don't know. Yeah, it's been a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your patience and for being here with so much attention. And see you again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for another 12 hours of good conversations.